The invitation arrived in the mail 2 weeks earlier, printed on heavy, cream-colored cardstock with elegant script detailing the location and time of Sarah's company's anniversary gala. The event was scheduled at an upscale hotel in downtown San Francisco, the kind of place with gleaming marble floors, high ceilings, and chandeliers that looked like clusters of diamonds. Sarah had mentioned it offhandedly one night over dinner, giving a light-hearted shrug when I asked her what her role would be. Just showing up and smiling, she had said, brushing off the importance. But I knew better. Sarah's job at that firm wasn't just another 9 to 5. Her name held weight. Her reputation was one she'd carefully built over the years. I could tell she was proud of it, and truthfully, so was I. By the time we arrived, the hotel's main ballroom was packed with people, all gliding from one conversation to the next, balancing champagne flutes and cocktails with practiced ease. Sarah slipped into the crowd naturally, her presence greeted with warm smiles and nods of recognition. She was dressed in an emerald green dress that skimmed her shoulders and flowed down in elegant folds, setting off her red hair and somehow making her eyes brighter. A few people paused to compliment her as we moved toward the center of the room. "Mark, let me introduce you," she said, catching the sleeve of my jacket as we reached a small circle of people gathered near the bar. She introduced each one with ease. Rachel, a reserved financial analyst with a dry wit. Peter, who handled accounts and had a look that suggested he barely trusted anyone. And Daniel. Daniel stepped forward, smiling widely as he extended a hand toward me. He was tall, with a confident stance, dressed sharply in a tailored suit that suggested he was as particular about his appearance as he was about his business. There was an ease about him that made him instantly likable, even magnetic, and I immediately understood why he held sway here. The grip of his handshake was firm, deliberate, almost a challenge wrapped in civility. "Sarah has told me a lot about you, Mark," he said, smiling as he gave a quick glance in her direction. "She always speaks highly of her husband." "She's good at that," I replied with a smile, but as the words left my mouth, I caught a glance, fleeting, but it was there, between Daniel and Sarah. Just a moment, barely perceptible, but enough to lodge in my mind. It was something familiar, something unspoken, and though it was subtle, a trace of doubt found its way into my thoughts, like an unexpected shadow on a clear day. Peter, the accounts manager, launched into a monologue about the firm's latest success, apparently some major deal involving a high-risk investment in the tech sector. He spoke about it with a hint of excitement, his hands moving animatedly as he explained the financial potential. Daniel nodded in agreement, occasionally interjecting with his own thoughts on the matter, particularly how these tech stocks were practically guaranteed to bring in substantial returns. Everyone around seemed hooked, nodding along with Peter's fervor. But Sarah, she crossed her arms, leaning against the bar with a skeptical look in her eye. "Not convinced?" I asked, watching her expression. "Oh, I know enough to stay clear of it," she replied, her voice calm but firm, like someone seasoned enough to know the limits of a gamble. "They're taking a big risk. Tech stocks like that, they can swing wildly. It's not something I'd recommend." "Not even to your clients?" I asked, surprised. Sarah had always been bold in her advice, often taking chances, though calculated ones. She shook her head, her gaze steady. "Not when I wouldn't even invest in it myself. My clients trust me, and if it's not solid, it's not worth the risk." As she spoke, I noticed Daniel's eyes on her. He seemed almost amused, a slight smirk playing at the edge of his lips. It was as if he found her caution endearing, maybe even charming. And though Sarah's tone didn't waver, there was a distinct tension that hummed between them, as though their professional disagreement held another, less visible layer. I felt my gut twist in response, a quiet unease surfacing. I reminded myself not to read too much into it. Sarah was respected, and Daniel was, well, charismatic. Nothing more, right? The conversation shifted quickly back to the other people in the group, though I kept finding my gaze drawn back to Sarah and Daniel. He seemed relaxed in a way that most people aren't at these kinds of gatherings, where formality and politeness usually dictate interactions. There was something in the way he leaned toward her as she spoke, the easy manner in which he laughed at her offhand comments. At one point, his hand briefly brushed her arm, An innocent enough gesture to anyone else, but one that felt, at least to me, uncomfortably familiar. "Can I grab you another drink?" Sarah's voice broke through my thoughts, and I realized she was looking at me expectantly. "Yeah," I replied, offering a smile I hoped masked my curiosity. "I'll get it." I made my way to the bar, ordering a bourbon for myself and a refill of Sarah's drink. When I returned, Daniel was speaking in hushed tones to Sarah, leaning in close enough that it appeared almost conspiratorial. The moment I stepped into their line of sight, however, he straightened up, his expression shifting to one of casual indifference. "So, Mark," Daniel said as I handed Sarah her glass, "Sarah tells me you're a project manager for a construction company?" "That's right," I replied, measuring him with a nod. "Mostly residential projects." "Ah," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "Residential is the heart of any city, isn't it? Houses, neighborhoods, they're what make a city feel like home." "Exactly," I replied, though I sensed a faint patronizing edge to his words. Maybe it was the way he said city, as though what I did was small-scale compared to his high-stakes finance world. Still, I smiled politely, unwilling to let him sense any irritation. Daniel's gaze slid back to Sarah, and he offered her a faint smile. "Well, Sarah's the one I'd trust with my investments. She's got a sharp mind when it comes to these things." Sarah gave a soft laugh, brushing off the compliment, but her eyes shone a bit brighter. It was then that I noticed the slightest shift in her posture, a subtle tilt toward him that would have been imperceptible had I not been watching so closely. An instinctive discomfort knotted in my stomach, but I pushed it away. There was no reason to let my imagination run wild over a professional interaction. They worked together, shared a mutual respect. Nothing more. The evening continued, but I found myself watching them almost involuntarily, each glance, each subtle gesture feeding my growing suspicion. It was like seeing puzzle pieces out of place, yet they were small enough that I could almost convince myself I was overthinking it. Finally, Sarah turned to me, a bit breathless. "Mark, I'll be right back," she said, giving my arm a gentle squeeze. "Need to check on something with Daniel before we leave." She disappeared with him through a set of doors that led to a quieter hallway, leaving me alone by the bar. It was the call from a headhunter that kicked off the whole Seattle idea. I was at my desk when the phone buzzed with an unknown number, and the voice on the other end introduced himself as Evan. He cut straight to the point, explaining that a large development firm in Seattle was looking for a project manager, someone experienced with residential builds and skilled at overseeing big teams. The offer sounded tempting, of a higher salary, a signing bonus, and relocation support. That night, I brought it up over dinner with Sarah, expecting a bit of resistance. She'd never seemed keen on leaving San Francisco. She had her circle of friends, a thriving career, and familiarity with the city's rhythm. Yet, as soon as I mentioned Seattle, she lit up. "Oh, Seattle's amazing," she said, a touch of enthusiasm slipping into her voice. "The views, the quiet pace, the forests, everything's beautiful up there. I think it could be a perfect place to start fresh." I blinked, surprised by her tone. "You'd be up for it?" She smiled, swirling her wine glass. "Why not? A change might do us good." Her eagerness seemed almost out of character, but I shrugged it off. Maybe she'd had a change of heart about San Francisco's high pace. Or maybe the talk around her office was getting to her. The firm had been going through some shake-ups lately, and she'd hinted that her manager was taking questionable risks with client investments. It struck me as odd, though. Sarah wasn't the type to run from anything, let alone a company where she'd built her entire career. I pressed a bit. "Is everything okay at your firm?" She hesitated, glancing down at her plate. "Things are fine," she replied, but the casual tone in her voice felt forced. "I just think we should be smart about this, that's all. If a stable opportunity's opening up for you, why not take it? We could have a fresh start." The relocation process moved quickly after that. The Seattle company offered me the job, and within a week I'd signed the contract. Sarah didn't just agree. She threw herself into the details. She started talking about Seattle's neighborhoods, the property market, the schools, even though kids weren't on our immediate radar. But when it came time to organize her own departure from her firm, her enthusiasm waned. She'd come home late each night, slipping in with a curt apology and a vague explanation of closing accounts and tying up loose ends. It was during one of these late nights that my phone rang again, another unknown number which turned out to be Daniel. "Mark!" His voice was warm, polite, the professional edge still intact. "I hope it's all right that I'm calling. Sarah gave me your number. I figured I could be of some help, as she's sorting out some last things here in San Francisco." "Oh," I replied, masking my surprise. "What's she needing help with?" "Oh, nothing much," he said smoothly. "Just the usual transitions. She's leaving a lot of big accounts behind, and some clients are a bit unsettled. I offered to help with the handover, make sure everything goes smoothly. You know how it is, clients like continuity." The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I couldn't put my finger on why, but something about Daniel's eagerness struck me as strange. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "It's good to know she has support, but I thought she was handling most of this on her own." Daniel's chuckle filtered through the phone, low and reassuring. "She's handling it all right. She's remarkable with her clients, you know that. But I also know the pressure she's under to wrap things up. Just wanted you to know I'm here if either of you need anything." "Thanks, Daniel," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm sure she appreciates it." As I hung up, a sense of unease settled over me, stubbornly refusing to be shaken. If Sarah had given him my number, why hadn't she mentioned it? And if everything was as simple as he made it sound, why did I get the impression that he was pushing for something more? Over the next few days, Daniel's name started cropping up with increasing frequency. Sarah would drop it casually in conversation, mentioning that she'd stayed late with him to finalize some documents or that he'd volunteered to help her out with some last-minute client inquiries. She spoke about it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, but I couldn't ignore the knot forming in my stomach each time she brought him up. His sudden involvement seemed to go beyond friendly support, more like a constant presence she'd come to rely on. One evening, Sarah returned home later than usual, her face flushed, a hint of tension in her posture. She barely looked at me as she kicked off her heels and hung her coat, heading straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. "Tough day?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Long one," she replied, leaning against the counter. Daniel stayed back with me to wrap up some account details. He's been such a lifesaver, really made the transition easier. I nodded slowly, feeling the words stick in my throat. "You seem to be leaning on him quite a bit." She paused, glancing at me over her glass. "He's a friend, Mark. He's just helping." I let it drop, though the conversation stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after she'd fallen asleep. Was I being paranoid? She was leaving her entire career behind in San Francisco, so perhaps Daniel's assistance was simply professional. But a nagging doubt lodged itself in the back of my mind, an itch I couldn't scratch away. A few nights later, I got a text from him. "Hey, Mark, just wanted to check in and see if you needed anything on Sarah's end. I know these transitions can be hectic." I stared at the message, debating whether to respond. It felt off. Why would he be reaching out to me at all? Sarah was the one working with him, not me. I replied with a simple, "All good here, thanks," hoping to keep the communication brief. But within seconds, a response appeared. "Glad to hear. By the way, if you're ever in the area, feel free to stop by the office. I'd love to grab a coffee before you two head off to Seattle. We'll miss having Sarah here." Miss her? I couldn't tell if he was being polite or if he was letting something slip. Either way, the message left me unsettled, the vague unease I'd been feeling now sharpening into something more concrete. When I mentioned Daniel's message to Sarah the next day, she brushed it off with a shrug. "He's just being friendly, probably trying to make sure there are no hard feelings about me leaving the firm." Her tone was dismissive, yet there was a defensiveness I hadn't expected. I dropped it, deciding I'd be better off keeping an eye on the situation myself rather than pressing her about it directly. As the moving date drew closer, Sarah's distance only grew. She seemed preoccupied, her attention always elsewhere, and her replies felt more like rehearsed responses than genuine conversation. Daniel's name had become a constant in our home. His presence felt even when he wasn't there, and as the days ticked down, I began to wonder just how much of this support was really necessary. The move to Seattle was a whirlwind. The company had set me up with a temporary apartment, but after 2 weeks of searching, we finally found a secluded house on a bluff overlooking Puget Sound. It was a place that felt like a retreat, with wide windows framing endless views of evergreen forests and a quiet that seemed to echo from miles away. It was everything Sarah had raved about, a slower pace, the fresh start she'd been so keen on. Sarah joined me a few days after I'd settled in, arriving with that same energized enthusiasm I'd seen during our initial talks about moving. She walked through the house with a sense of ownership, noting where she'd placed the furniture, imagining family gatherings or cozy weekends watching the mist roll off the sound. Despite the lingering suspicions I'd brought with me from San Francisco, I found myself relaxing, hoping that perhaps this change of scenery really would put everything behind us. Work ramped up quickly, demanding long hours and frequent travel as I oversaw various construction projects around the Seattle area. I would leave early and come back late, often with just enough time to eat and catch a glimpse of Sarah winding down with a book or on the phone with her old friends. She'd been applying for jobs in Seattle, too, eager to start fresh at a new brokerage, but that hadn't panned out yet, which seemed to be weighing on her. One Friday evening, after a particularly long week, I came home to find her at the kitchen counter, poring over some documents, her face lit by the low glow of the hanging lights. I hadn't seen her this focused in a while, and for a moment, I thought she was finally working on leads for a new job. "Busy night?" I asked, setting my briefcase down. She looked up, a hint of excitement in her eyes. "Actually, yes. I've been researching something that I think could be really good for us." I raised an eyebrow, amused at her intensity. "Oh, what's that?" Sarah gestured for me to sit, and then spread the documents across the counter in front of me. I could see headings that mentioned mineral rights, property deeds, and drilling permits. My amusement faded, replaced by curiosity. "Mineral rights?" "Yes," she said, her tone shifting into that of an advisor pitching a high-stakes investment. "This is something Daniel brought up before I left. It's a growing trend. Investors buying up mineral rights on vacant land, then leasing them out to drilling companies. With the way land values are projected to climb, especially in parts of Washington, it's a high-potential market." I frowned, glancing over the documents without really absorbing the details. "And Daniel suggested this to you?" Sarah nodded, her voice barely containing her excitement. "He's already invested himself. He's been helping me understand the market, and it's practically guaranteed. The drilling companies pay high leasing fees, and we wouldn't even need to own the land outright, just the rights. It's low risk and high reward. Mark, this could be our ticket to a better financial future." She was talking with an eagerness I hadn't seen from her since we'd moved, her face alight with the thrill of discovery. But there was something about this that nagged at me, something unspoken but solid. I leaned back, crossing my arms. "So, we buy these mineral rights, and then what? We just wait around for the big bucks?" Her enthusiasm didn't waver. "More or less. The demand is growing, especially with the state easing restrictions on drilling. The timing is perfect, and Daniel has experience in this. He's offered to help us through every step." The mention of his name sparked a flicker of unease. I hadn't seen Daniel since we'd left San Francisco, but his presence had followed us, lingering at the edge of our lives through Sarah's updates. The way she talked about him, as if he was a trusted advisor, a friend, even, it felt strange to hear her so confident in something he'd suggested, but I didn't want to dampen her enthusiasm. "All right," I said after a long pause. "What's the catch?" She gave me a small smile, as if she'd expected the question. "No catch, but Daniel suggested that we give him a bit of oversight, just for legal purposes. He has connections with landowners in the area and can make the process much smoother. If you're okay with it, I'd like to give him limited power to handle the logistics." I stared at her, trying to process this. "You want to put our money into a project that Daniel has control over?" Her face softened, eyes pleading. "He wouldn't have total control, Mark. I'd be managing everything. It's just a formality to make things easier, especially if you're traveling as much as you are. I promise, I'll handle it all carefully." I hesitated, feeling a knot of hesitation in my stomach. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. I did, or at least I wanted to. But the idea of involving Daniel, letting him have a hand in something that concerned our finances, left a bitter taste. "If we do this," I finally said, "I want access to everything. I'll need to see every transaction, every piece of paperwork. I don't want a single step taken without me knowing. She nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face. Of course. I wouldn't have it any other way. Look, why don't I just set it up? You won't have to do a thing, but check the accounts when you need to. I'll keep everything transparent, promise. She leaned across the counter, her hand reaching for mine, a hopeful smile playing at her lips. The look in her eyes was one I hadn't seen in a long time, and for a moment, I found myself willing to believe that maybe this was a genuine opportunity. Maybe, after all the strange and uncomfortable feelings back in San Francisco, this was a chance for us to realign, to finally be on the same page. All right, I said, squeezing her hand. Let's give it a shot, but I'm holding you to that promise. The next few days passed quickly, with Sarah diving headfirst into the setup of the investment, her enthusiasm as contagious as it was unwavering. She spent hours on the phone with Daniel, talking about land values and projected returns, comparing mineral rights contracts from different properties. I tried to stay involved, checking in with her every evening, but the details quickly became overwhelming. She assured me again and again that Daniel was merely helping to facilitate, that there was nothing shady or complex to worry about. One evening, after a late-night phone call with Daniel, she approached me with another stack of documents. "Mark, I need you to sign these," she said, holding out a pen. I glanced at the forms, the legal jargon swimming before my tired eyes. "What's all this?" "Just the partnership agreement," she explained, placing a hand on my shoulder. "It gives me authority to act on your behalf when you're away. This way, you won't have to worry about approvals or getting held up by paperwork." I took a breath, feeling the weight of the decision. "Are you sure this is necessary?" She nodded earnestly, her gaze unwavering. "Absolutely. We'll make it back tenfold, I promise. This is exactly what we need to secure our future." With a final nod, I signed the papers, feeling a strange sense of resignation. Sarah's excitement hadn't faltered once throughout the process, and I wanted to believe in her conviction. But as I handed her the pen, that nagging sense of discomfort lingered, a whisper of doubt that I couldn't quite shake. As Sarah filed the papers, her face was alight with triumph. "You won't regret this," she said, her voice soft with reassurance. I wanted to believe her, but as I watched her disappear down the hallway, the doubts only grew stronger. The first signs of something deeper going wrong were subtle, easy to dismiss. It started with Sarah taking calls in hushed tones late at night, stepping out of the room when the phone buzzed, her voice carrying just faintly through closed doors. When I asked who'd called, she'd laugh and say it was Daniel, or a client, shrugging it off like it was nothing. I wanted to believe her, so I did, pushing away the discomfort gnawing at the back of my mind. Then there were the business trips. A few weeks after the mineral rights deal, Sarah started leaving town for 1 or 2 days at a time. I'd come home to find a note left on the kitchen counter. "Back in a day or two, don't wait up." Her handwriting seemed hastily scrawled, and she rarely offered details about where she was going. Each time she returned, her answers were vague. When I pressed, she'd say something like, "It's just a quick client meeting, no big deal." But the last time she left, I'd asked which client, and she couldn't look me in the eye when she said the name. One Friday night, as I was preparing to head out on a weekend trip for a project, I noticed her staring at her phone, glancing my way as if gauging whether or not I'd left yet. The moment I announced I was on my way out, she practically shooed me out the door, all but pushing me toward my car. I drove to the hotel and checked in, but the unease followed me, refusing to settle even after I'd gone through my usual routine of ordering a late dinner and catching up on emails. By early Saturday morning, I made up my mind. I'd head home early and see what was going on for myself. I packed up quickly and drove back, arriving just after noon. Sure enough, Sarah wasn't home. A faint hunch tugged at me, and I remembered the cafe she'd mentioned a few times in passing, a small, tucked-away spot by the waterfront where she often met clients. I decided to stop by, though I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. As I approached the cafe, my heart sank. Through the glass front, I saw Sarah sitting at a small table by the window, her head tilted toward the man across from her. It was Daniel. They were leaning in close, speaking in quiet tones, his hand resting casually on her arm as if it belonged there. The way she was looking at him, it wasn't businesslike, not even remotely. She seemed absorbed. I pushed open the door and walked inside. Sarah looked up, her face blanching when she saw me. "Mark," she exclaimed, recovering quickly, though her voice wavered. "You're back early." Daniel's hand slipped from her arm as he straightened, putting on a mask of polite surprise. "Didn't expect to see you here, Mark," he said, his tone smooth and unfazed. I felt my stomach twist, but I kept my voice steady. "What's going on here?" Sarah gave a quick, nervous laugh. "It's not what you think. Daniel and I were just going over some last-minute details about the mineral rights." "In a cafe? With you two leaning in like that?" I raised an eyebrow, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Daniel leaned back, his gaze level. "I can assure you, Mark, this is strictly business." The tension in the air was thick, a kind of unspoken hostility that made it impossible to let the conversation end there. I turned to Sarah, waiting for an explanation that never came. "Mark, don't make this into something it isn't," she said finally, her voice a little too controlled. "You're overreacting. Daniel's been a huge help with the investment, you know that. There's nothing more to it." I didn't answer right away, studying her face, trying to detect any hint of regret or guilt. But she maintained her composure, barely flinching under my stare. Finally, I nodded, deciding that pushing further here would only turn into a public scene. "Fine," I muttered, before turning and leaving the cafe, though her voice lingered in my mind, each word loaded with a barely contained tension. The encounter rattled me enough that, the next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I hadn't wanted to go this route. I believed in trust and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But the image of them in that cafe was burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. After a bit of searching, I found a private investigator named Carl, a quiet man in his 40s with a nondescript appearance and a reputation for discreet, thorough work. Carl listened patiently as I outlined the situation, jotting down notes in a small notebook. He didn't interrupt, didn't interject with questions, only nodding now and then. When I finished, he looked up, his expression neutral. "I can look into Daniel," he said simply. "Gather some background, see if there's anything unusual. It may take a few days, but I'll keep you updated." 3 days later, Carl called me back, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of something I couldn't quite place. "Mark, I think you'll want to meet in person for this." We met at a diner outside of town, a place where I was sure we wouldn't run into anyone familiar. Carl slid into the booth across from me, a manila folder in hand. He placed it on the table between us, but instead of opening it right away, he spoke. "Your hunch wasn't far off," he began, keeping his tone low. "Daniel has a bit of a history, to put it mildly. Several women he's been linked with in the past few years. Most of them colleagues or clients, all under the radar, no official complaints, but enough rumors to raise eyebrows." I clenched my jaw, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. "So, he has a pattern." Carl nodded. "Not only that, he's been involved in a few dubious investment schemes. Promises of high returns, but there's little documentation to back any of it up. Most of it's buried in legal language, but the signs are there. He's not the kind of guy you want handling your money, especially when it comes to something as risky as mineral rights." I opened the folder, my eyes scanning through snapshots of documents, notes on his past associations, and a few grainy photos of Daniel with various women, some of whom bore expressions that looked all too familiar. Enchanted, almost entranced, like Sarah had been at that cafe. The pieces began to click into place, but with them came a rush of anger and betrayal. When I brought the folder home that evening, I waited until Sarah had settled in before handing it to her. She looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes as she took it. "What's this?" she asked. "Read it," I replied, keeping my tone even. I had Carl put together a few things about Daniel. "I thought you should know who you're getting so close to." She opened the folder, her face shifting from curiosity to shock, and finally, to anger. She closed it abruptly, pushing it back toward me. "So now you're spying on me?" She snapped, her voice sharp. "I wasn't spying on you," I shot back, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I was trying to understand why you're spending so much time with a man who has a pattern of infidelity and questionable investments." Sarah's face hardened, a look of cold resolve settling over her features. So that's it? You don't trust me. You're willing to believe some private investigator's report over your own wife. It's not just that, I replied, feeling the sting of her accusation. It's the late nights, the business trips that don't add up, the way you look at him, like you're part of something I can't even see. She scoffed, crossing her arms. You're paranoid, Mark. That's all this is. I'm working on a business opportunity, one that you agreed to, and you're letting your insecurities ruin it. Her dismissal of my concerns, the way she brushed it off as paranoia, left me reeling. We stared at each other, a gulf of silence stretching between us. I realized, in that moment, that whatever trust I'd once had in her had been fractured beyond repair, each suspicion, each doubt widening the rift. Well, she said coldly, breaking the silence, if that's how you feel, maybe you should stay out of this investment entirely. The next few days passed in a blur, each one filling me with a growing, gnawing sense of dread. The coldness Sarah had shown that night stayed with her, a steely resolve replacing any warmth that might have remained. Every conversation was clipped, her responses tight, calculated, as if she were rehearsing each word before she spoke it. We were living in the same house, but it felt as if an invisible wall had risen between us, a wall of unspoken accusations and suspicions that neither of us dared cross. Carl reached out 2 days later, his voice carrying an urgency that I hadn't heard from him before. Mark, we need to meet, he said without preamble. I've uncovered something that can't wait. I agreed to meet him at a small, out-of-the-way diner near the edge of town. When I arrived, Carl was already there, seated in a booth with a stack of papers spread out in front of him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he motioned for me to sit, tapping a finger on a specific document lying open on the table. Take a look at this, he said, his voice low. This is a partnership agreement for an LLC, newly formed, barely a month old. It's registered under your name and Daniel's, with Sarah listed as the managing partner. The LLC is set up to control a series of assets, including all mineral rights under your recent investment. I stared at the document, feeling as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath me. This can't be right. I never signed up for a partnership with Daniel. Carl nodded grimly. I suspected as much. But take a look at the signatures here. He pointed, and there, in ink, was my own signature scrawled at the bottom of the page, next to Daniel's and Sarah's. That's not possible, I said, my voice coming out as a whisper. I don't remember signing this. You did, Carl replied. Or rather, you thought you were signing something else. I went through your mineral rights paperwork, and there are duplicate documents hidden in the stack. You were signing more than you realized. A bitter taste filled my mouth as the realization settled in. Sarah had been slipping these extra papers into the ones I'd been signing. Trusting her enough not to read every single line, I had unwittingly signed away partial control over our finances, our assets, all under the guise of the mineral rights investment. There's more, Carl continued, watching me closely. I followed the paper trail, and it led to a lease on a luxury apartment downtown. One rented under Sarah's name with Daniel listed as an authorized occupant. My stomach turned. A lease? They're planning to move in together? It appears that way, he replied, sympathy in his eyes. They're not just taking your money, Mark. They're trying to take over everything step by step. This LLC is the foundation, but it's clear they're planning to cut you out permanently. A flood of memories came back to me. Sarah's late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way she had brushed off my concerns. Each memory sharpened into a blade of betrayal, cutting into me with brutal precision. They weren't just having an affair. They were orchestrating a takeover of my life. Thank you, Carl, I managed to say, my voice hoarse. I appreciate everything you've done. He nodded, packing up his papers. I'll keep digging if you want, but I think you have enough evidence here. It's up to you what you want to do next. I left the diner, the stack of papers under my arm feeling as heavy as lead. Back home, I spread everything out on the dining table, examining each document, each damning piece of proof. The partnership agreement, the LLC registration, the lease to the apartment. The story they told was unmistakable, and every detail made the betrayal feel sharper, more personal. When Sarah came home that evening, she barely looked at me as she dropped her bag on the kitchen counter, reaching for a glass to pour herself a drink. I waited until she'd taken a sip, watching her carefully. The distance in her gaze was palpable, like she'd already made up her mind to keep me at arm's length, even in our own home. "Sarah," I began, my voice steady. "I know about the LLC. I know about the lease with Daniel." Her glass froze halfway to her lips, but her expression remained impassive, betraying nothing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes, alarm perhaps. "Don't lie to me," I replied, my voice colder than I'd intended. "I've seen the papers. I know you and Daniel are planning to take everything. You've been setting this up from the start, haven't you?" She set her glass down, crossing her arms as she regarded me with a look of disdain. "You're the one who's been distant, Mark. Always away for work, never here, never present. Do you really think I would just sit around and wait for you to come home whenever you feel like it?" "So, that's your justification?" I asked, incredulous. "That I work too much? That I trusted you enough to handle our finances?" Her eyes narrowed, a glint of anger flashing. "You never trusted me." "Not really. You just expected me to sit here and wait while you went off to play project manager. Daniel offered me a chance to do something more, something meaningful." "Meaningful?" I scoffed. "So, draining my accounts, setting up a partnership behind my back, that's your idea of meaningful?" "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said, her tone icy. "Daniel is helping me build something stable, something you could never understand because you're too busy chasing paychecks and construction projects. We're planning for the future, Mark, something you never had the courage to do." I stared at her, the realization of her ruthlessness settling heavily in my chest. This was no misunderstanding, no lapse in judgment. She was resolute, standing by her betrayal as if it were a point of pride. "I trusted you, Sarah," I said quietly. "I trusted you with everything." Her gaze didn't waver. "Then maybe you should have been more careful about who you trust." There was the final nail in the coffin. She wasn't apologetic. She was proud of what she'd done, confident in the choice she'd made to betray me. And in that moment, I knew that whatever connection we'd once shared, whatever promises or commitments had once bound us, they were nothing more than empty words. She picked up her drink, her gaze steady, daring me to react. But I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I collected the documents, stacking them neatly in a folder, my mind already working through my next steps. There would be no more arguments, no more confrontations. I'd seen everything I needed to see. The woman standing before me wasn't my wife. Not anymore. "You'll regret this, Sarah," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, a faint smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe I will, but something tells me that's a chance I'm willing to take." The air in my office was stale, thick with the weight of everything I'd uncovered, but my mind was clear. After that final confrontation with Sarah, I'd known I had to tread carefully. There was more to her betrayal than she'd let on. I could feel it, a cold instinct gnawing at me, telling me this went deeper than stolen assets. And if there was one thing I'd learned from the papers Carl had shown me, it was that neither Sarah nor Daniel was done yet. The next morning, as I sifted through a stack of documents on my desk, a receipt caught my eye, peeking out from the corner of a folder I didn't remember placing there. I unfolded it, feeling a chill as I read the details. A purchase made in both Sarah's and my name, 2 full sets of high-end hiking gear from a specialty outdoor shop. The receipt was recent, just a few days old. My heart pounded as a memory came back to me. Sarah's mention weeks ago about wanting to spend more time together in the outdoors, reconnecting after everything we'd been through. She'd painted it as a reconciliation trip, an attempt to patch things up. But now, knowing what I did, it seemed too calculated, too perfectly timed. Just as I was processing this, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah, her voice cheery, almost casual, too casual. "Mark, I was thinking, how about a little getaway? A hiking trip, just the two of us. A chance to clear the air and start fresh." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to match her tone. "That sounds like a good idea. Actually," I replied, "we could use a bit of time away." She sounded genuinely pleased, as though she'd expected resistance. Wonderful. I was thinking the Cascades. Daniel mentioned a cabin up there we could use, sort of a base camp. He offered it up as a peace gesture. Isn't that nice of him? I felt a surge of nausea at the mention of Daniel, but I forced a laugh. Very generous. He seems invested in our future. Oh, you have no idea, she replied, her tone laced with a hint of something unsettling, something I couldn't ignore. I'll set it all up. Don't worry about a thing, all right? I hung up, a new level of dread settling over me. It was no coincidence. Sarah's sudden enthusiasm, the purchase of hiking gear, Daniel's involvement, all of it led to one horrifying conclusion. They didn't just want my money. They wanted me out of the picture entirely. A clean break, a staged accident that would leave them free to take everything. And with a substantial life insurance policy already in place, they'd be set for life. I made a decision then and there. If they wanted me on this trip, I'd go, but it would be on my terms. The weekend arrived, and Sarah's cheerful facade was still firmly in place. She handed me a new set of hiking boots as we loaded up the car, explaining how the rugged terrain would require good traction and strong ankles. The cabin Daniel had offered, she said, was tucked deep into the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by steep trails and towering pine trees. Her tone was a little too eager, as if she were rehearsing lines for a role she'd been given. The drive was tense, neither of us saying much. She chattered idly about how fresh mountain air was supposed to be good for the mind, how she was looking forward to reconnecting. I nodded along, letting her talk, but my mind was on the gear stashed in my backpack, the hidden GPS tracker, the small recording device, and my phone programmed with a tracking app that I'd shared with Carl. I hadn't told him everything, just enough to ensure that someone would know where I was at all times. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. It was isolated, perched on the edge of a cliff with a view that stretched over the endless forest below. The mountains loomed above us, casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The cabin itself was small but well kept, with a wraparound porch and a single trail leading deeper into the mountains. Perfect for an accident, I thought bitterly. Once we were settled, Sarah suggested we start our hike early the next morning before dawn. The sunrise is supposed to be spectacular, she said, her eyes gleaming with that same unsettling excitement. And besides, Daniel said that's the best time for clear views. My pulse quickened. So, Daniel had planned this route as well. Everything was falling into place, piece by calculated piece. I forced a smile. Sounds good. I'll set my alarm. The morning arrived, dark and cold. I dressed quickly, securing the small recording device in my jacket pocket before joining Sarah outside. She was already waiting, bundled in a new hiking jacket, her smile bright and forced. We set off, the quiet of the pre-dawn forest enveloping us as we made our way up a narrow, rocky path. The silence felt heavy, charged with the anticipation of what was to come. Halfway up the trail, Sarah slowed, pointing to a narrow ledge that jutted out over a sharp drop. Look, she said, gesturing to the edge. You can see the whole valley from there. I glanced down, noting how one misstep would be enough to send someone plummeting to the rocks below. My stomach churned as I realized this was likely the spot they'd chosen. I looked back at her, my expression neutral. Go ahead, she urged, her voice light, but with a strained edge to it. I'll take a picture of you with the sunrise behind. I nodded, stepping closer to the ledge, though I kept a careful distance from the edge. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint glow over the horizon, and for a moment, everything was silent, peaceful. Then I heard it, a quiet footstep behind me, deliberate and too close. I turned just in time to see Sarah's arm moving toward me, as if to push. I sidestepped, my hand grabbing her wrist as I spun to face her, the shock in her eyes mirroring my own anger. What are you doing, Sarah? I demanded, my voice low. Her face twisted into a mask of irritation, her forced smile fading as her real intentions surfaced. Mark, I just want to get closer to see the view. That's all. Don't lie to me, I said, holding her gaze. You didn't bring me out here to reconnect, did you? For a moment, she didn't respond, her face a study in conflicting emotions. But then, her expression hardened, a flash of anger flaring in her eyes. "You always ruined everything, Mark," she hissed, her voice low. "You and your suspicious nature, your endless questions. Daniel was right about you." "Daniel," I repeated, bitterness lacing my tone. "So, it's his idea to stage an accident?" She laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "He just wanted to make things easier. He wanted us to be happy, free of all this." She gestured around us, as if the scenery were to blame. "And yes, he was right. You don't belong here, Mark. You never did." I let go of her wrist, my mind racing. She'd admitted enough, revealed more than she realized. I took a step back, watching her closely. "You're making a mistake, Sarah," I said calmly. "You think you're doing this for freedom? You're giving up everything for a man who's only using you." She scoffed, her expression cold and dismissive. "Believe what you want. This will end how it's meant to." Without another word, she turned and stormed down the trail, leaving me alone on the ledge, the morning sun casting long shadows over the mountain. I spent the rest of the day in the cabin, pacing the small, darkened space as I replayed everything Sarah had said. The recording was secure, each word etched into the device like a confession sealed in ink. Now I just needed a plan, a way to turn this around on them before they made their next move. The absurdity of it was that I was in the middle of the mountains, alone with two people plotting to take everything I had, including my life. Late in the afternoon, I got a text from Sarah. "Meet us by the cliff trail at dusk. Daniel wants to talk." I replied simply, "See you then," letting my fingers hover over the screen for a moment. This was it. I tucked the recording device into my jacket and dialed Carl, quickly explaining the situation in as much detail as I could manage. I told him everything, what Sarah had admitted, the staged accident, the cabin location. "Carl, I need you to be tracking us," I said, my voice a harsh whisper. "This isn't just financial anymore. I'm talking about a plan to get rid of me permanently." There was a pause on his end. "Understood. I'll contact the authorities, let them know to be on standby. Don't do anything reckless, Mark. And whatever happens, keep that recording safe." I hung up, stashing my phone securely in my pocket. The evening was settling in, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the peaks and valleys. It was eerily beautiful, almost serene, and under different circumstances, it might have felt like the kind of place I want to get lost in. But tonight, I'd have to stay sharp, keep my mind on every movement, every word exchanged. When I reached the cliff trail, Daniel was already waiting, leaning casually against a boulder as if he didn't have a care in the world. His jacket was open, his stance relaxed, but his eyes carried a glint of something sharper, something predatory. Sarah was standing nearby, her expression guarded, a flicker of nervousness beneath her outward confidence. "Mark," Daniel said, smiling broadly. "Glad you could make it. Thought it'd be good to clear the air once and for all." "Funny," I replied, keeping my tone calm, controlled. "That's exactly what I was thinking." Daniel chuckled, taking a step forward. "You know, we could have done this peacefully. Just a clean split, everybody moving on with their lives. But you had to complicate things, didn't you?" "Complicate things?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You're talking about complicating, but you're the one scheming with my wife to make me disappear." "I think the complication started there." His smile faded, replaced by a harder expression. "Sometimes things don't work out the way we want. Sarah here was unhappy, Mark. And you know, unhappy people can be desperate to find a way out." I shifted my gaze to Sarah, her face tight, her eyes flickering with a mixture of resentment and guilt. "And did he tell you that, Sarah? That I was the problem? That everything would be better without me?" She didn't meet my eyes, instead focusing on the ground, a hint of conflict crossing her features. "You were never here, Mark. Always off in your own world. I was tired of it." And then, her voice trailed off, her expression hardening again. "Then Daniel showed me things. He made me see how you were lying to me, how you'd been cheating on me all along." I felt a jolt, a surge of disbelief that twisted quickly into anger. "What are you talking about? I never cheated on you, Sarah. Not once." She looked up, finally meeting my gaze, her face pale. "Daniel showed me emails, texts, messages you'd sent to other women. He said he'd been helping me, letting me see the truth." I laughed bitterly, the pieces falling into place. And you believed him? This man who just waltzed into your life, who had everything to gain by making you hate me. She hesitated, the mask slipping. For a split second, I saw the doubt, the recognition of her own mistake flicker in her eyes. But then Daniel's hand clamped on her shoulder, and her expression hardened again, locking back into place. Enough of this, Daniel snapped, his voice low. It's time to finish what we started. I took a step back, my hand sliding into my jacket pocket, my fingers brushing against the recording device. Funny you should say that, Daniel, because I think this conversation is just getting started. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his face darkening. What are you talking about? I pulled the recording device out, holding it up so they both could see. I've been recording everything, every word Sarah said about your plans to get rid of me and take everything. This isn't just talk anymore. I've got proof. He froze, a flicker of panic crossing his face, his calculating calm finally slipping. That's a nice toy, Mark. But who's going to believe you? All it takes is one fall, and that recording won't mean a thing. His hand twitched toward me, and I took a step back, carefully maneuvering myself toward the edge of the trail, where a few hikers had appeared in the distance, coming around a bend. I raised my voice, making sure it carried. Go ahead, Daniel. Let's see how this ends for you, with witnesses watching your every move. You want to play this game? Then do it in front of them. He hesitated, glancing past me to the approaching hikers, his confidence visibly waning. Sarah's expression faltered as she noticed the people coming closer, a flicker of fear breaking through her controlled mask. But Daniel wasn't ready to let go. With a final, desperate move, he lunged, trying to grab the recording device from my hand. I twisted out of his reach, stumbling back as he advanced, his eyes wild, all pretense of civility gone. Let it go, Daniel, I said, my voice firm. You're finished. Suddenly, he lunged again, this time shoving me back toward the cliff's edge. My foot slipped, and I teetered for a split second, catching myself just as one of the hikers called out, their voice filled with alarm. I steadied myself, raising my hands in a placating gesture as I spoke loudly enough for them to hear. Daniel, this is over. The authorities know. They've been tracking our location since we arrived. He froze, his face paling as the hikers closed in, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. Is everything all right here? One of them asked, their eyes flicking between the three of us. Daniel's jaw tightened, his gaze darting between me and the hikers, calculating his next move. But he must have realized it was too late. With witnesses around and the recording in my pocket, there was nothing left for him to do but back down. Sarah took a step back, her face ashen, the realization settling over her like a weight. She looked at Daniel, her expression twisted with anger and regret. You lied to me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You made me believe he was unfaithful. All of this, it was you. Daniel didn't answer, his face contorted in frustration. The hikers were close now, murmuring among themselves, watching the scene with guarded curiosity. I took a steadying breath, nodding to the nearest hiker. Thank you for your timing, I said, glancing at Daniel one last time. You just saved my life. Daniel's face fell as the hikers stood between us, and I turned away, leaving him and Sarah to the bewildered looks of the crowd gathering around. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation as we all waited for the proceedings to begin. I sat at the front, my eyes fixed forward, barely noticing the packed gallery behind me or the rows of suits and skirts lined up in the jury box. The weight of the past few months pressed down on me. Sarah's betrayal, Daniel's manipulation, the lies, the plans for my death. Today it all came to this. And as much as I hated to admit it, part of me felt a grim satisfaction in knowing they would finally face justice. Daniel was led in first, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, his hands shackled in front of him. He no longer had that smug, self-assured look I'd come to despise. His face was pale, his expression hollow, as if the weight of everything he'd plotted had finally crushed whatever arrogance he once carried. Sarah entered shortly after, looking smaller, less certain. She scanned the room, and for a moment, her eyes found mine. There was a flicker of something there, regret, anger, maybe even shame. But I held her gaze coldly until she looked away, sitting next to Daniel at the defendant's table. The prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Elaine, began with her opening statement, outlining the charges against both Daniel and Sarah. Conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted murder, financial deception, all meticulously detailed as she laid out the chain of events. She introduced the recording device, the paper trail, the LLC, and even the life insurance policy Daniel had orchestrated. Piece by piece, Elaine stitched together a tapestry of their betrayal, a story so chillingly complex it almost felt surreal. But every word was the truth, and as she spoke, I could see the jurors watching Daniel and Sarah, their expressions hardening with each new revelation. Then it was my turn to testify. I stood at the witness stand, facing the jury, who waited in rapt attention. Elaine led me through my story. The discovery of Sarah's affair, the manipulation by Daniel, the setup for the mineral rights investment that was never intended to succeed. When she asked about the hiking trip, their plan to fake an accident that would leave me dead on a cliffside, I felt a chill pass over the courtroom, the gravity of it hanging in the silence that followed. Elaine nodded, her face calm but determined. "And did you take any steps to protect yourself financially, mister?" she corrected herself, turning to me, a slight smile at the corners of her lips. "Mark." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. About a month before the trip, I'd begun to suspect something was wrong. So I transferred the majority of our joint assets into a trust, a fund set up to protect my finances in the event of, well, this. Daniel's face paled, the realization of what I'd done settling over him like a shadow. Sarah's reaction was different. She stared at me, her expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. She hadn't known. She'd thought she and Daniel would end up with everything, free to build their lives on what they'd stolen from me. But I'd seen through it, setting up that trust as a final safeguard, an insurance policy to prevent the very outcome they'd schemed for. Elaine continued, guiding me through the final pieces of my testimony. As I recounted the confrontation on the cliff, the recording device, and the hikers who had witnessed Daniel's attempt to shove me over the edge, the courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. Daniel's lawyer tried to object, tried to undermine my story, but it was futile. There were witnesses, evidence, a clear trail of intent and action. At last, it was Sarah's turn to testify. She stepped up reluctantly, her eyes downcast as she was sworn in. Her lawyer coaxed her through her side of the story, portraying her as a victim, manipulated and deceived by Daniel, blinded by his lies. She admitted to the affair, her voice barely audible, acknowledging her bitterness and how Daniel had fed that resentment, showing her falsified evidence of my alleged unfaithfulness. But there was one twist I hadn't seen coming. "He told me Mark had been cheating on me for years," she said, her voice tight with emotion, each word sounding hollow in the empty quiet of the courtroom. He said I had been nothing to Mark, that he was planning to leave me, drain our accounts. I thought," she faltered, casting a glance at me, her face crumbling. "I thought he didn't love me." She confessed that Daniel had orchestrated it all, fabricating texts and emails to make her believe I was unfaithful, planting ideas of betrayal in her mind until she no longer recognized the man she'd married. For the first time, I saw the weight of her regret as she realized how easily she'd been deceived. But it wasn't enough. Whatever remorse she felt couldn't erase what she'd done, couldn't undo the choices she'd made. Her bitterness, her willingness to believe Daniel over me, had led her down a path that destroyed everything between us. As she returned to her seat, I felt a strange, unexpected pang of pity for her. She'd been manipulated, yes, but she'd also allowed it. She'd chosen Daniel, embraced the lies because they fit the narrative she wanted to believe. The trial concluded with the final statements, the prosecutor's closing arguments hammering home the lengths Daniel and Sarah had gone to, an elaborate web of lies and deceit intended to end in my death and their financial gain. The jury deliberated, and it didn't take long. Guilty. Both of them. Conspiracy, attempted murder, fraud. Each word felt like a release, a weight lifting from my shoulders as the verdict was read. Daniel slumped in his seat, his expression blank, defeated. Sarah, on the other hand, sat rigid, her face a mask, as if she'd finally resigned herself to the fate she'd helped create. The fallout in the days that followed was swift. The bank froze Daniel's assets, exposing a series of shady dealings that left him financially crippled. I heard whispers that he'd lost everything, that his supposed fortune had been a carefully constructed illusion, a string of leveraged investments and loans that crumbled the moment he was outed. Sarah, too, found herself stripped of everything she'd once taken for granted. With her conviction, her accounts were seized, her name disgraced. As for me, I moved on, though not without scars. I finalized the divorce and left Seattle, the memories of everything that had happened weighing on me as I set out to rebuild my life somewhere quieter, away from the ghosts of betrayal and deceit. I thought of Carl, the investigator who'd helped me unravel their scheme, and felt a pang of gratitude for the steady professionalism he'd shown throughout. Without him, their plot might have succeeded. Months passed, and I found a new rhythm, a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. I bought a small place near the ocean, spending my days watching the waves and relearning how to trust myself. The experience had left its mark on me, a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. But in the end, I'd survived. I'd seen through their lies, outwitted them at their own game, and come out the other side stronger for it. The past was behind me, and with it, the faces of the people who'd tried to take everything. I was free. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.